One of the strange sort of tissues of morality in the 21st century is the game we play with white Western moneyed countries, quote unquote, rescuing dissidents from dictatorships. Someone stands up and dares to criticize the government of China, and they're thrown in prison. Say the American embassy, the French embassy, perhaps even the Canadian embassy stands up and demand that this person be released, and if released, the white Western nation promises they'll take in this critic of the dictatorship as a refugee in their own country. And in this way, sources of instability are recruited into the ranks of the underpaid, underemployed new immigrants in Western countries, and they cease to be a source of criticism. They cease to be a force for dynamic change in their countries of origin. I know people pat themselves on the back for this. They feel there's a sort of heroism in rescuing Wei Jingsheng, for example, from China. Any of the dissidents in China, any of the dissidents from South Africa. When I was a kid, that was always the big story, would be people in this sense rescued from South Africa and Chile, dictatorships now largely forgotten for having repressed people who complained against them, protested against them, and so on. The world would be, in a profound and subtle way, a very different place if the attitudes of those Western democracies was, no, the future of China is yours and not ours to decide. And if you want democracy in China, you shouldn't become a refugee living in Montreal. You should stay in China, organize, antagonize, speak your truth to power, fight. And it's tragic. It's tragic to see what happens. It's tragic to see that someone like Wei Jingsheng spent so much of his adult life in prison. So many of the people who've criticized China, every despotism around the world, even Saudi Arabia now, end up in prison or end up disappearing. But aren't we simply helping those critics of authoritarian governments to disappear in a very different sense? Aren't we just doing the dictator's dirty work for them by absconding with these people and silencing them in a different sense, by taking them away to a place like Montreal where they can no longer possibly be part of the political struggle in the country of origin? There's a strange sort of moral pageantry to what the United Nations now is and does in the year 2019. The United Nations has an almost infinite budget compared to a tiny, poverty-stricken, powerless country like Laos in Southeast Asia. The budget per annum for the United Nations is about $50 billion. A small intervention, a small project from the United Nations will spend something like $300,000 per year. The amount paid even to United Nations volunteers in salary is infinitely high compared to local Lao people struggling to make a living. So when I was there, a nurse at a hospital would make maybe $15 per month. A nurse who had really been to university, was highly educated. I knew of some who made $45 per month, but they were receiving $15 from the Lao government, and the other $30 was coming from international donors. It was precisely coming from agencies like the United Nations, maybe not the UN, maybe European or other donors were increasing their salaries. There were definitely medical doctors earning $30 a month and so on. And you'd have the lowest level volunteer for the United Nations would be earning maybe $3,000 per month. Of course, full-time staff, much, much more than that. They were, as the title of the book says, the Lords of Poverty. Why were they there? They were there supposedly in pursuit of the highest ideals set down by third-rate philosopher Immanuel Kant and fourth-rate President of the United States, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Doctrine of the Four Freedoms, and so on. All those pious resolutions that were made at the end of World War II, the United Nations is supposed to embody and push for that kind of progress. And what do they actually do? Here's Philip Alston, set to visit Laos to examine poverty and human rights issues. This is supposedly the advocate for positive social change. This is supposedly the man who's going to come and speak truth to power. This is supposedly an advocate for democracy, human rights, freedom of expression. All the things that in a tiny communist dictatorship like Laos, people lack, along with access to education, clean drinking water, the things that people in Western countries tend to take for granted. UN expert says Lao government policies make life worse for poor, marginalized. Wow, that photograph really tells you all you need to know about this total outsider arriving in a village in Laos with no knowledge of the language, no knowledge of the history, no knowledge of how even the current bureaucracy and government works. Just a total ignoramus with an infinite budget showing up, making his tour of the countryside in 11 days. The Lao government's economic policies have worsened the living conditions of the nation's poor and marginalized populations while widening the gap between the haves and have-nots, a United Nations rights expert said Thursday at the end of an 11-day official visit to the country. In a statement issued at the end of his March 18th to 28th visit, Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, said that improvements in the lives of the poorest Laotians had not kept pace with the country's economic development. Despite important progress in reducing poverty, the Lao government's economic growth strategies have too often destroyed livelihoods, entrenched vulnerability, and actually made some poor people poorer by taking away their access to land, livelihoods, and resources. Here are some quotations from an interview he gave at the end of his in-depth 11-day trip to Laos. Quote, I spent 10 or 11 days in Laos, and I was looking mainly at the situation of people who live in poverty. But the reality is that in Laos, the model of economic development that's been followed has made the wealthy very rich and created an also wealthy middle class, but the rest of society has not benefited. So they've had huge and record economic growth, but they've also put almost no serious resources into health, education, social protection. And so people are not getting access to good schools. They have very low levels of health care. The education standards are bad, and the government has just not invested in the human capital, which it needs to do. Now, let me ask you, if you were the government of Laos, would you respect this man's opinion? If you were the common people of Laos, would you respect this man's opinion? If you were even a journalist just covering events in Laos who devoted years of your life to learning the language, history, and politics, why would you have any respect for this man's analysis based on 10 or 11 days of work? He doesn't know the language. He doesn't know the history. He really doesn't know anything. He's a man with a ruler who's shown up to take the measure of the nation. But let's carry on for a moment here. What are his recommendations? Is he calling for democracy? Is he calling for revolution? Is he calling for some fundamental changes in the lives of the poor? Is he calling for some fundamental changes so that Laos lives up to those ideals that the United Nations was set up to protect, propound, and enshrine? Question, what specific obstacles must the government face in order to improve the lives of average Lao citizens? Oh, here comes the answer. I think the challenge is for the government to adopt a policy which is less centralized. They need to permit a much greater degree of openness within civil society. They need to move towards more transparency in government. People need to be able to know what sort of contracts have been signed with foreign investors. You don't think they need to be able to vote for more than one political party? You don't think they need to be able to elect who's in charge? You don't think they need to be able to recall members of government and put them in prison when they've been found to be corrupt or taking bribes? You don't think they need to have... No, that's no. You think the poor in Laos need to be able to examine contracts that have been signed with foreign investors? Are you sure you're not representing, say, a neoliberal foreign investor's interest rather than the interests of the poorest of the poor in Laos? Gee, how did you get your priorities so mixed up here? It sounded like just a minute ago you were saying the problem is that they have very poor education, very poor healthcare, so on and so forth. How do you think they're going to change that? How do you think you're going to have a government that's by the poor and for the poor by having more transparency in the signing of contracts with foreign investors? There needs to be a way for those who are being resettled to make complaints which will be taken seriously and not met with brutal repression. So your point is the people are going to be resettled anyway, but their complaints should be taken seriously. What about a democracy where you don't live in a military dictatorship that just resettles you whenever it's in the government's convenience to build another gold mine, build another highway, so on and so forth? I don't know. It just sounds to me like you're not really dealing with the fundamental issues here after your 10 or 11 days in the country. Quote, I actually don't think that those changes would require too much of the present government. It has done some very positive things. It has started to crack down on corruption. They say that every year. It has consulted on some issues, but it hasn't yet gone nearly far enough to really make sure that the people are aware of what's going on and that it's receiving the necessary information about the actual situation in the country. Look, guys, the problem with the United Nations is not just the evil that it does. It's not just its direct involvement in, some of the worst atrocities in the history of the world after World War II. And it's not just wrapping those atrocities in the flag of the United Nations. There's a real question of opportunity cost here. There's a real question of what might have been. I think it's very sad that the main source of discontent in these countries is being, in a sense, recruited into silence by being taken away year after year, generation after generation, as refugees. The people who could be the conscience of the nation, the people who could be the canary in the coal mine, the people who could be crying for political change, organizing for and instigating political change, are ending up in the suburbs of Paris and Montreal, and some of them in New York, and some of them in Long Beach, California. Big Laotian community in Long Beach. And then on the other hand, the people whose job really is to advocate for a country like Laos to meet the minimum standards of human rights and democracy are instead the most corrupt people in the world. They're the United Nations. They are the lords of poverty. Dun, 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 dun.